Wayne got the joke. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
So glad we're all here together. Hey, so I got a little grief last week that apparently Nicodemus is not a child's story, a children's Bible story. So, and then I was told this one isn't either. I went and got a child's collection of, Bible stories for kids book at our house and picked this one, okay? So it's in a child's Bible, all right? Caroline, are we recording? Okay, thank you. So continuing the series, it made it onto YouTube, so I think it's official now. This is the series Children's Bible Stories for Adults. How many of you all read, well, I don't know if anybody, how many of y'all read Judges 7 for the first time this week? I figured as much. Most people are familiar with this story. Same as last week, we may run over stuff you're already familiar with, but this is as I think all stories in the Old Testament are, this is a really fascinating story, and there's a lot there for us to extrapolate if we take a little time and do so. I'll tell you what, let's pray, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity to study your word together. Thank you that in grace inconceivable, you have revealed yourself to us in your word. As we consider Israel, Lord, guide our hearts to understand what we might learn about ourselves as we see how you have dealt with your people throughout time. Lord, I pray that you guide our conversation, that we would glorify you in all that we do. We ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, Judges chapter 7, the story of Gideon and his, and I've got it in quotes, mighty men. We'll talk about why I've got it in quotes here after a while. Judges chapter 7. It's on the board if you're close enough to read it. Judges chapter 7. I'll tell you what, let's dive right in, beginning in verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained." Okay, before we go any further, who is Gideon? What do you know about Gideon? He was a farmer. Yeah, he was a farmer originally. So do you remember where we meet Gideon? What he's doing? He's hiding. Where is he hiding? In the winepress. So he's threshing wheat or separating wheat from chaff in the winepress. Why is he? So he gets kind of pinned for hiding. But why was he hiding? He wanted to eat. What might have happened if he hadn't been hiding when he was, and it hadn't been maybe odd hours to be doing it, when he was separating wheat from chaff? The Midianites would have gotten him. So let's back up and build a little context. So in Judges 7, we're somewhere around 1150 BC. So this is after Moses and before, Saul, for example. It's a time of the Judges, right? We're in the book of Judges. So Gideon is actually kind of smack in the middle of the Judges, roughly. Does anybody know who he follows after? One that's kind of controversial. Well, you can find something controversial about all of them. There's two that we kind of lump together that are before Gideon. It's Deborah and I don't know how to say it. I've heard Barak. I've heard, Barak got kind of weird like about 14 years ago to use that one. But yeah, whatever it is, B-A-R-A-K is the transliteration into English. So yeah, we've got Deborah and Barak. I don't know. And so now we're with Gideon. So Gideon is a judge. And Does anybody know? So we're told a little bit about Gideon in the previous chapter. Does anybody remember anything else about him? Yeah, so he has a little g god in his name. Does anyone actually know? So it is a compound. This is, all right, here we go, Major. Hold on. So this is a compound. So the way that we can understand it, again, and we're dealing with, bear this $10 word, if you will, transliteration, which is, because Hebrew isn't written with the 26 characters we have in the English alphabet. I mean, have you ever seen Hebrew written? I mean, it's indistinguishable to me. It just looks like a bunch of lines in a row. So we have to do something kind of twice. We have to translate it, but then we have to approximate their sounds and their characters into our characters in English. So it's transliteration. So Jerubbaal is it is two words, and Amy is right. Which one is the little g god? Baal, right? We've heard of Baal. So this is a common Canaanite god. Jerub actually is, I believe, this is, yes. So R-I-Y-B is our transliteration of this word, Raib. And this word literally means to grapple. So Gideon's name, as God gives it here in chapter 7, is something like to grapple with Baal. Now, if you remember chapter 6, why is that an appropriate name for Gideon? Yeah, he tore the altar down. Does anybody know what Gideon means? Gideon means conquer and destroy. So we have Gideon, which means conquer and destroy, and then we have Jerubbaal, which is grapples with Baal. So yeah, that's exactly right. He's got a little g god in his name, which is kind of interesting. Anybody remember who his dad is? So that's the more important detail. Yeah, he was a Baal worshiper. It was Joash the Abiezrite. And bonus points, does anybody know which tribe Abiezrites belong to? I know it's cheating. I had, 3 days. So according to Joshua chapter 17, oh, you got it? Tribe of Manasseh. That's right. Okay, so Gideon, again, just to understand where we're at, Gideon is in the time of Judges. He himself is considered a judge. And Amy was exactly right. The reason that we find him, the reason we meet him threshing, for all intents and purposes, wheat in the cover of perhaps darkness and also in an odd place, is because if he hadn't been, the Midianites would have come and taken it. Why would the Midianites have been able to come and take the wheat? Right. The Midianites are the exact language that the language the Bible uses is that God gave Israel over to the Midianites, and Matt's exactly right. It's because of their disobedience. That all matters in the broader scope of the narrative of Gideon, and we'll talk about that some in a minute. But I just want us to be thinking about that the whole reason we're here, right? The whole reason that we need someone. I mean, think about the absurdity. Imagine someone having to step up and start a council for us to tear down a Buddha that we have in our baptistry. That's just an odd place to begin with, and that's exactly what we find with Gideon. Okay, so verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead." Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Any of you with a study Bible, do you have a cross-reference for verse 3?
Have a what?
A cross-reference like a different a reference to a different passage in verse 3?
Well, what about Deuteronomy 28?
Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse
20,
8.
Verse 8.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Do you have it? Can you turn there?
Okay. The officers shall speak further to the people and say, what man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart, lest the heart return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart.
This is the first time I realized this, and so I thought it was worth noting. This was not just a dig at the people of Israel on behalf of God. This is actually pointing back to a concession made in the law for fighting men. What you read from in Deuteronomy is part of the law being given, and this was actually in the law that men who were afraid in heart were sent home. And the reason given in Deuteronomy is so that they won't influence their brethren around them and make them nervous as well. I just want to point that out to us as we go through. Let's continue in verse 4. Oh, yeah.
I've got a sum up for verse 2 and 3 in John 3:30. And it says, he must increase, but I must decrease. Is what
I wrote that verse down too.
Well, we can. Yeah, and we can certainly talk about that. That's kind of the meta narrative of Gideon. Let's go a little further and we'll discuss. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Does anybody know, before we get there, so we're at 10,000 men of Israel. Does anybody know about how many the Midianites have, according to the estimate in the Bible? I think one estimation is 135. But there's we'll get there about how many there are. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, every one who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give you the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So he took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below them in the valley. That same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number as the sand that was on the seashore in abundance. This picture, what we understand historically about the Midianites, part of what their success was, the phrase is sometimes used, swift camels. Part of their MO, there's more Latin, major modus operandi. Part of their MO is that they would use fast camels to overcome their enemies. That was a trademark of the Midianites. And so what we're told about the ones who were encamped is that there are so many of them that their support livestock were innumerable, that we could even maybe understand this literally, that the person who wrote this story down was unsuccessful in estimating how many there would have been, because we are given estimates of other things at times. And we're already all over it with what we've talked about so far, but what's the oddity? What sticks out about this so far? So you've only had 22,000, you sent 22,000 home, so you had about 32,000, right? You have very few men. You have an enormous fighting force camped nearby. You send 32-ish thousand home. So in terms of percentages, you send all your people home. And So what's weird? Yeah, the easier question is, what isn't weird about this? It makes no tactical sense. So not only do we send men home, but the way we do it is odd. So what we know is that they are encamped, just by being encamped in proximity to Midian, I think we can reasonably assume that they're compromised tactically as it is. I mean, just the being outnumbered the way they are. And what they do is they say, okay, well, we're going to send some home. And God says, no, that's still not enough. And by the way, why did he want to send them home? Yeah, he says, you know what? I'm not going to let you take credit for this. If I give them into your hands now, which, okay, maybe one of our first application points, how silly would it be to think that 30,000, 32,000 fighting men overcoming 140,000 fighting men, or whatever it was, wasn't miraculous in the first case? What does it say about what God knows about the heart of, and I won't say Israel, I'll say the heart of men, that even with 5 to 1 ratio, somewhere between 4 to 5 to 1 ratio, and he says, if I give them into your hand, you won't even recognize that I've given them into your hand. He knows their heart. And it doesn't reflect well on them what their heart thinks and what he knows their heart would say. And so he sends 22,000 home, but he says, this is still too many. We've got 10,000. So how do we get down to the last batch? It is the most, yeah, it's the most arbitrary test. The funny thing, Kurt, I've always thought, not only does it not make sense, the outcome that they stuck with seems to be the inferior soldier to me. I've since been challenged in that position, and I'll share that in a moment. But yeah, we send a whole lot more home, and the way we divide them is we have sparring matches, and we see who wins the sparring matches, and we keep reducing our number. No. Well, we look at who has the most experience fighting. No. We send everybody down to the river, and we say, okay, take a drink. Somebody's out there with a clipboard, and they're watching, and they've got their OSHA vest on and their hard hat, taking notes on how they do it. Have you ever thought about, does anybody remember coming in from recess in elementary school and having to go to the water fountain to get a drink, like when it was hot out? Am I the only human who experienced that as a child? Okay, just checking for a pulse. Do you remember the 1, 2, 3, save some for me, or some of these, that just, yeah. I never liked it because I drank a lot. I still drink a lot of water to this day, and I would be hot, and I would want to drink a lot of water, and there'd always be somebody, either a teacher regulating it or inevitably some student who would remind you that your time was up. And the way it worked when I was in elementary school is you had to go back to the back of the line. You would never think it would take that long to get 10 people through the process of having a drink, but it certainly at that time, it felt like an eternity. And if you think about it logistically, it does take a while. We're talking about 10,000 people. And we're talking about expending serious resources here, if nothing else, the resource of time. And as the legal term says, time is of the essence. Right? I mean, this is a considerable commodity to surrender when you are this outmatched. And so don't read over it and just think about how silly of a test it is. Think about how odd it would be to do this in the first place. I mean, this would be very time-consuming. 10,000 people. Kurt, one thing I've always thought about, how muddy would the water be after 10,000 people stomped through it to drink it? I would be wanting to be at the front of that line. You get to the end and it's just murk, and you're like, well, this is lose-lose. You're just hoping it doesn't make you sick at that point. But yeah, so we keep the 300 who lap the water like dogs. Some commentaries think the deal is that they, in order to do this, they would have reached down and cupped it in their hands and brought it up and lapped it like a dog. Because in my head, I used to have it that they like got down on all four and stuck their head in the water and did it, but I don't think that's how it reads. But some people have argued that the reason that's significant is that if you kneel down to take a drink versus bringing it up to your head, what's the key difference?
You're alert, watching.
You're watching. You can see what's going on. What's the problem with thinking that's why these 300 men were chosen? Because I don't think that's why they were chosen. That's the...
I don't think any of them was chosen for their military expertise.
Right.
Because they never, all they did was,
Right.
well, you know the story.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have to fight.
Yeah.
So these men are just, I don't know how they was picked.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, they're placeholders. The whole point, these are not, that's why it's in quotes. These aren't mighty men. They could have been anything. I mean, assuming they had enough breath in their lungs to blow a shofar and enough strength in their arms to bust a clay pot. I mean, it didn't matter who the men were. And I think it's a neat idea that was some tactical relevance, but what ultimately kills that theory, and I'm relying on you having heard the story before, what's beyond the meta-narrative of understanding what the point of Gideon is, but I mean, literally in how they fought the battle, what's the other dead giveaway that it's not a tactical decision? They never were given weapons. It couldn't have been about how capable they were as fighters. And if they were, that was silly in some sense because they never gave them weapons in the first place.
Let me ask you this. Those that just, that were chosen and everything, do you think, I think they were scared. I think they were scared and they was looking around, for a spear or something.
Maybe so. So maybe they were alert, not because they were smart, but they were alert because they were worried.
Yeah.
It would.
And the others were just worn out, so tired, or maybe so scared, they just bowed down and started like a dog.
I think whatever your reasoning is, I think being intimidated is a completely reasonable conclusion. I mean, you have to think about, I just can't imagine you can get 10,000 men on board with this and not have some of them going, wait a minute, what are we doing here? So yeah, let's go a little further. I believe we're at.
Can we back up just a second, Brady?
Yeah.
Go to verse 9. This is always what's intriguing about the story. The same night before the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given them into your hands. But if you are afraid, go down to camp with Pur, your servant." The significance of taking the servant, but in the story, unless I missed it, God understood that was going to be fearful for him with all the men that he sent, and understood where he was at. I say as a person, as a human, you sent my whole army home. There's only 300, and the Lord tells him, "Hey, if you're scared, I understand that. Take somebody with you, but I'm going to give you this sign to see that it's going to be okay." But I don't remember God judging him on that. Does that make sense? Like and I might have missed it, but I don't know if God ever gets mad at him for being afraid and not necessarily being obedient right away. Does that make sense? Like, take Moses. He was judged when, "Hey, I told you to talk to the rock, not to strike the rock." Like, it was instant, like, this is what it is. I don't remember it here, God judging or putting judgment on Gideon for being afraid of what he told him to do, or the situation that God put him in.
Yeah, and I think one of the lessons there is that fear and disobedience are two different things. The difference between what Moses did at the rock when he struck it and what Gideon did or didn't do is a difference of obedience. I think you're absolutely right. I planned to comment on that. That's such a funny verse. The omniscient God who has put Gideon in an unbelievably compromised position from man's wisdom anyways, goes, "Well, if you're afraid," yeah, no, duh. Yeah, of course I'm afraid. I'm terrified.
But who he told him to take is even more like, don't take your best warrior, like
Yeah.
your servant.
Yeah, take a servant. Yeah, sure, I get it. You're afraid. Take a servant. Go down there.
From the very start, he knew, Gideon knew what God wanted him to do. So all this is a struggle with what? Fear and doubt.
Fear, faith, obedience.
I mean, it wasn't, that fleece he threw out and everything. It wasn't trying to get, people today, they try to get God's will and everything. He already knew God's will and what he wanted to do, did he not?
Right. He told them he was going to give them to him.
And So he was just strictly, I don't know, do you think he'd have gone down without his servant?
I don't know. It's interesting that God offers that advice. You know, he provides that counsel before we ever hear Gideon's response.
You know, God just provides everything. I mean, everything. All we have to do is obey, do we not?
That's the
And faith.
Yeah, well, and that's what my note was about that passage is if you want a picture of grace. So mercy. So let's go back to that 10,000-foot view. Mercy in the story of Gideon is that God has raised up, and Gideon's the placeholder. He's going to accomplish what he wants to. But the mercy in this story is that God has relented of his chastisement of Israel for their disobedience. The grace is that even as he has promised this to Gideon, this doesn't quite fit the mold of prevenient grace. That's more specific. But even before we have record of Gideon's objection, he offers, that's grace. He says, and if you're worried about it, I've given you yet another sign so that you can be sure. Right? Right. Absolutely. What the place that it's so funny, and we'll get there. Gideon's not a hero. I mean, he's just not. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But he's just not a hero. And there's things about his character that I think what we do. So we have this really interesting this presumption in heroism in the West, and I think it's a lot of the product of pop culture. I don't know how deep it goes, but when you think about our superheroes, they're really infallible, right? And the role of superheroes is to save the innocent from nefarious evil. That's really, if you think about our comic book heroes and you think about how we like things clean cut, black and white, we have this infallible hero saving innocent bystanders from happens chance peril. That's not what's happening here. These are not innocent victims of happens chance peril. These are a people who have disobeyed and profaned the one holy God, and there was punishment for it. Right? So somebody turn to Proverbs 3, chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. I don't know if you've thought about Proverbs any time in the last year, but don't say yay or nay right now. You might hurt someone's feelings. Can somebody read 11 and 12? Right, so this isn't happens chance. This is a father who is not derelict. This is a loving father. Spurgeon said that the Lord does not permit his children to sin successfully. Right? That God does not let his children off the hook for sin. And the simplest way I understand that is because God, more than any of us ever can, fully understands the weight and consequence of sin. Right? And so what we see here, yes, is an opportunity for faith. And Gideon is remembered in Hebrews that he's not a hero, and again we'll talk about that in just a little bit. He's not a hero, but he is remembered in the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But let's not forget that it was faith, not being afraid, and that faith works itself out in obedience. And even as we see faith working itself out in obedience, don't miss the grace of God, that even knowing he would be afraid, that he had provision for him to give him assurance.
What about verse in the previous chapter, verse 34? That's where the strength and power.
That's right. That's right. That's like here in just a minute we're going to read that for the sword of Gideon. well, as far as I can tell, he was not carrying a sword, right? Right. So,
See who's doing it.
right, absolutely. Let's push on just a little bit further. So 13, when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. And his comrades answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. Now, I talked about the sword of Gideon. I think there are two swords of Gideon. I think that there is the actual sword of Gideon, and I think there's what the men thought the sword of Gideon was. And I want to make that distinction specifically because this is a very significant thing. Does anyone know the significance of it being a barley cake? Barley cake is what poor people ate. Barley cake was the generally least desirable of the breads at this time. Barley was a lowly kernel, was not a desired material or cooking ingredient. This is what the lowest of the low would eat. So this whole idea that there was a cake of barley tumbled into the camp. So not only is it barley bread, but it's barley bread that's rolled in the dirt. There's a very real sense in that this would not be a flattering thing to say. You know, I mean, they're saying, this is Gideon. And I have to wonder, I've tried to think of an English parallel. I can't think of one right away, but this is something that colloquially Gideon would have not been necessarily flattered by, right? That he's a barley loaf. You know, he could have been a French baguette, or he could have been ciabatta. I don't know if those existed at that time, but you know, this was the $1 loaf of sandwich bread at Walmart. This was not the artisanal garlic bread, okay? And this is what Gideon is compared to. But he says, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. 15 continues, as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. That's important. Put a pin in that. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand, and divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and put trumpets into the hands. That's the chauffeur. So that's a stereotypical imagery for Jews, like the horn, right, that would kind of spirals that they blow sometimes. That's probably what this was. Trumpets in the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. Boy, there's some language that crops back up in the New Testament. When I blow the trumpet, 17, and he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle of the watch, when they had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, and held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. They cried out, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade, against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah, towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Okay, let's pause. So what's the outcome? Yeah, they killed themselves. So the question's answered. What are we going to do with a jar and a torch and a trumpet? What's the answer?
Show how big God is.
Yeah, you're not going to do anything. You're going to show how big God is. You're not going to do anything. And we don't have to wonder. This is what's so great. And the reason that I would not encourage us to speculate on the test is because there's a bigger picture we don't have to speculate on. We're told why this was done. God says very clearly, I'm going to do this, so you can't take credit for it. This is just, I'll tell you what, let's go a little bit further. This is verse 24. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the waters as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. And they captured the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. Then they pursued Midian, and they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon across the Jordan. I think there are a couple of things, and we've really, and this is of great encouragement to me. The best thing that can happen when you're teaching, and I think anyone who teaches can attest to this, the best thing in the world that can happen when teaching is y'all spoil my fun. When I don't get to the punchline, that's a bad term for it. When I don't get to arrive at my delivery that I'm building up to, that's the best. Because that means that the Spirit is moving and teaching, and we're all reading the same inspired word, and we're all being taught the same thing together. So we're already all over this, but just for the sake of exercise, as far as I count it, there are at least 5 opportunities for faith in the story of Gideon. What would you, how would you list them out if you were going to pick some opportunities for faith? So why would it be an act of faith to stay in? Right. So this is multifaceted. We'll add that. So staying to fight, right? When you're so outnumbered, which again is so funny because as I think we see, part of the problem is even if they had stayed and fought and won with 32,000, they might have still thought they did it. So in the same vein of staying to fight, and this faith is broad. It can be the faith of Gideon, the faith of the other men. The next one I would say is sending men home. Right. So again, I love it. You're grabbing my punchline. So yeah, we send men home. Another opportunity for faith, and don't miss this one, doing the test. What a silly thing to do. What a poor use of time, doing the test. And then as Nate said, sending men home. We do it again, right? So we send men home. What else?
I think the way that he sent men home, the faithful listening of, say, who to choose and who not to choose. I mean, very easily, how many times I say in our lives, we're like, well, God, let's do it this way. This makes more sense.
Right.
Like you said earlier, like leading the water, like that doesn't sound like the 300 that I would pick, or that doesn't seem like a good way to decipher individuals. Let me do it my way,
There's a logic that's used a lot by, and I'm not going to rope people in and imply that it's not people I think are believers or even devout believers, but there's a prevailing logic that God gave us reason, and so we're meant to use reason, and so God would never call us to do anything that would betray our reason. I think God did give us reason. I think that we are to employ reason when we can. But we're now 2 weeks in a row of absolutely exploding that idea. What was the example last week? I'll give you a hint. I've been doing impressions of Jennifer's face when I asked her the question all week. Remember what I asked her? I said, Jennifer, at what point in a treatment plan do you all start walking around with a bronze snake on a flagpole and waving it in the room? And she goes, we don't, right? Yeah, we don't do that. Why do we not do that? Because it makes no sense. Because there's nothing scientific or rational or medical about any of that. But was it successful in Numbers, the book of Numbers? Yeah, it was. It saved the people from the poison of the snakes they were bitten by, the fiery snakes. So 2 weeks in a row, we have these examples, we can't rest our laurels on our reason, even if it was given by God, even if it's a gift, even if reason is grace. Common grace at that, although not seemingly evenly distributed as common grace. Some have more than others, but we can't rely on our reason. So I think you're exactly right. I think that ties in that not just doing the test, but accepting the results of the test. What other examples of faith are there? Yeah. Yeah. So approaching the enemy, right? So what else?
I'd have to go and believe in what they said when they got there. Believe in what they heard when they got down there.
Yeah. I mean, how easy would it be? I like that. I'm going to run out of room, and my handwriting gets worse the lower we get, so I'm not going to put it up there, but not because I don't like it. I absolutely agree. How often, we keep moving the goalposts with God where we're like, well, yeah, if you'll do this, and then I'll know, and then, which Gideon is guilty of, right? I mean, the fleece, right? So we say, oh, yeah, but I mean, that could have, the chance that could have happened. I mean, this happens every day. This sign doesn't mean anything. I mean, we eat barley every week. They're starved. They're not getting enough water. I mean, bless their hearts, they drank that nasty mud water from everybody stomping in the river yesterday. They've had a dream. It doesn't mean anything. They're projecting what they want it to be. So yeah, I agree. I think that that's some faith. There's one more, like, huge one. Yeah, and exposing your position when you have what? You don't have anything. So yeah. So it's twofold. So blowing the trumpet, specifically with no weapons. Okay, there's something that I think we can see as a pattern, and this was said very early on. What happens every time we go down this trajectory? Every step we take, what happens? It gets harder. And as it gets less harder, another way we can understand it is it gets less probable. The success becomes less probable. Any of y'all watch college football? That was another question meant to be a joke. We're in the South. Thanks for laughing. If you follow along, there are different models that will plot out the likelihood of which team is going to win the game. And they do it continuously throughout the game, I mean, play by play. And so what you can see is at the end of a game, you can actually see a graph of how that line moved. And there's two ways to think that a game was really fun to watch. One of the ways to think that a game was really fun to watch is if it was always right here splitting the middle, right? So if here's 100, here's positive 100, negative 100 based on the betting line. Not that we're advocating for that, but so you can watch them ride that middle, which is what some people think a fun game is. What I think a really fun game is a game that may go along and then somewhere around quarter four it goes down here or it goes up here, right? And then there's an inevitable game-winning drive at the end, and you watch, and it has to flip, right? Completely the other way in a very short amount of time. The way I think games are fun is how steep that slope is on the likelihood of winning as it changes. To that point, this is one of those where, as far as any of our metrics are concerned, this is a decided outcome. Forget the fourth quarter. Like the fourth quarter, we're under the 2-minute warning at this point, okay? And of course, we know that it flips entirely. So yeah, as far as probability of success, it's continuing to diminish. But what else is happening? It's one of the first things we said tonight. I didn't say it. Somebody else did. It's a complete reliance on God. What was it? John's Gospel? What did we say earlier? Hey, look, I'm lobbing it up to y'all. Come on now. Yeah. What we see is a total departure from man and a continued paradigm shift to understand a reliance on God. I think this is important. And so Gideon, the mighty is in quotes because they weren't mighty. He could have been anybody. Like I said, anybody, they don't even need I said they need the breath in their lungs to blow the trumpet. On the authority of Scripture, I tell you, God gave them the breath in their lungs that they blew the trumpet with. What we don't need is ourselves. We would do so well to continue to understand less about the role we play and much more about the role God plays. I love the example. I still come back to this. We've talked about in Ephesians what it means to be humble. It's not low self-esteem, because really the problem with low self-esteem is you're still the focal point. You just don't think a lot of yourself, but you are thinking of yourself. But humility is to not esteem yourself at all. I love the story of Gideon. I think that one of the great pictures of if there's anything we should celebrate about Gideon, by my estimation, it comes right after he hears about the dream. Somebody read the first half of verse 15 for me, chapter 7. This is the point where Gideon catches on, as far as I can tell. This is him getting it. Because it's not just that he now believes, because it's not just that he was convinced in his mind, because in God's grace he gave him more assurance, but beyond that, he then took that and did what? He worshiped. Everything about this, from worshiping after to not caring who the men are, not caring about their abilities. The other way to understand not giving them weapons, again, it's not low self-esteem. It's not esteeming the warriors. It doesn't matter how skillful they are with a sword. We're not going to give them a sword anyways. We're not even giving consideration to their abilities, because the point is not the men. The point is not Gideon. The point is what God is doing. And we back all the way back out to that meta-narrative that we were talking about with Gideon. Remember, first and foremost, although it is a lesson on grace, and these are intertwined and one always follows the other, this is a lesson on mercy. What a picture. This is a lesson on mercy, because Israel was given to the Midianites because God's vengeful? No. Why? Their sin. And even in this mercy, there is grace upon grace upon grace to accomplish the mercy. It's not as if God's mercy is affixed somewhere and He invites us to it if we could get ourselves there, because that alone is incomparable as a gift. But that's not what it is at all. His mercy is affixed, and His grace delivers us to His mercy, not our own effort. That's an amazing thing. If you want for your perception to change into what we're taught in John's Gospel, and if you want to decrease as He increases, if you want to understand this, you can't even deliver yourself to His mercy. His grace must do that. I love the story of Gideon. Does anybody know, this is just kind of a bonus here as we wind down, does anybody know what Oreb, I guess this is going to be a theme of this, asking a loaded question. Does anybody know what Oreb or Zeb means? They have meaning too. So Zeb means wolf, and Oreb means raven. I don't know that we ever hear about Zeb again, but we hear about the rock of the raven later. In Isaiah chapter 10. And I think most translations translate it Oreb again, but as I understand it, as far as culturally, Israel remembers that rock where Oreb was beheaded as the rock of the raven, right? Is anybody in Isaiah chapter 10? I'm turning there. I remember the chapter, I don't remember the verse. I'm scanning. I'm sorry? 26, read it for us. The reason that Israel was told so many times in the Old Testament to make these points of remembrance, right? They were told after they crossed the Jordan to stack stones. Right? The reason that this matters so much, and what we can understand from this, is that you give a couple hundred years of history to develop as God deals with his people, and eventually, even as they think geographically, even as they name things in reference to what they used to be, because we do that too, right? When I hear y'all talk about what this area used to be, y'all could be talking about a different town for all I know. And you use points of reference based on what used to be there. Israel did that too. But the deal is the way Israel did that is they could go around all over Canaan. And they could come to a place and they could remember the name of it. They could remember the rock of the raven. And that was a time when God was faithful. Not them. In fact, the whole reason there's remembrance is because they weren't faithful, they were punished for it, and still yet God was faithful. They literally had landmarkers and milestones in remembrance of all that God had done. So why do I say Gideon's not a hero? Well, how does this, so what?
And this might go on what you're saying. I've been looking over this. From verse 1 to verse 14, the Lord is telling Gideon what to do, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's not until verse 15, the second part of that, where Gideon gets excited. He tells the people what the Lord's going to do. There's a switch there. It's all Gideon, do this. Gideon, do that. And he's doing it. You got to think the 300 men didn't know what they were doing. The Lord was like, who's running the show? It almost takes you back to the Exodus where the people were looking at Moses. They weren't looking through Moses as to who's talking to Moses. Don't know if that's the case or not for that, but it's that turn from there's excitement there, arise, for the Lord has given the hosts of the millions into our hands. Like he flips like, hey, this like God's doing this, not me. Like it was that reassurance to, I guess, the 300 that, hey, don't look to me for this. Like I'm just doing what I'm told. You need to look at who's actually doing this.
Yeah.
So it goes back to being a hero. He basically says, this isn't what I'm doing, this is what God's doing.
Yeah. So I think both are correct. You're right, he's not a hero in the sense that he rightfully recognizes who's doing it. He's not a hero in the sense that he doesn't finish strong. Not really. Wiersbe calls Gideon a coward, a conqueror, and a compromiser. That's kind of the trajectory his life takes. But there's a more obvious answer that I would posit this evening. And the reason Gideon's not a hero is because the whole point is Gideon's not the point. There is one champion in the Bible for you to read about. And it is not Gideon. It is the Christ. And this Advent season, do not miss Christ for looking at Gideon, because it's not Gideon. Right? This picture of salvation, these insurmountable odds, this request not to win the battle, but to act in faith, mirrors our assurance in Christ. Again, the mercy is affixed. We can't even get ourselves there. Any other questions, comments, concerns, snide remarks?
What's the significance of breaking the jars other than noise level?
I think it can go about as deep as you want it to. I don't know that I'm settled on it enough to commentate, which is saying something because I normally can't shut up about stuff. But
For me, something that was really important about the jars was I think Paul was referring to jars of clay. I think he was talking about this. When he says that we have been given jars of clay, he's talking about the persecution that we go through in our life. And when we're breaking, if we're filled with the Spirit, his light shines through our brokenness. That's
which again just really drives home. We're not the point, right? We're the clay to be broken so that the light in us can shine through. Read it. Amen. I think those men, in some sense, could feel that they were being given over to death. I think one of the hardest truths in the Old Testament and New Testament, certainly, but we see it worked out in stories in the Old Testament. We've talked about this in the book our book club is reading. There's a chapter on Abraham, the man who possessed nothing. One of the hardest lessons is not that we trust God up unto death, that he would deliver us, that we would trust God through death, that he would resurrect us. That's hard. Abraham, at no point that we're told in that story, thought that he wouldn't have to kill Isaac. Abraham just believed that he would be resurrected.
Amen.
What a model for our faith.
What's the one thing that's, for a Christian, their biggest enemy as a Christian? What is it?
Pride,
Doubt.
doubt.
When doubt, this is what happened. This is what you've been teaching all
Right.
night, about how he doubted God. And the sermon about Zacharias, I thought that was interesting because Zacharias, when Gabriel came to him, what did he do? Ask for a sign. And did he not ever get it?
Mm-hmm. But
you go on and read further, what did Mary do? What did she say to Gabriel? How is this possible? And he politely explained to her. It's all about doubting, and it's very dangerous. And I do it all the time, too much. But when you go back to the Word of God and pray about it and everything, that's what leaves you. It's the doubt. You just believe the inerrant, infallible Word of God. Do you know?
we talked about this when we were talking about Jesus clearing out the courtyard of the temple in John 2 that, and I alluded to this last week, that I understand it to be a miracle. And the temple guard comes to Jesus and they go, give us a sign for the reason you're doing these things. Give us a sign. Demonstrate to us the authority of you doing these things. And it's like, that whole thing was the sign. And we talked about how that's similar to Romans 1, right? It's all a sign, right? and others are reprimanded for wanting a sign.
God has proven himself just continuously, or he has in my life. And, you know, when I have failed him, the result was my doubt.
What changes is never what God's doing, but what man recognizes that God is doing. Same for Gideon, right?
Ooh, that's hot. Thank you, Brady. Brady taught last week because I was going to be out of town, and we were talking about it Sunday, and we have this series that we had talked about wanting to do, and I asked him if he would be willing to go ahead and teach this week as well. We're coming up on my end of the year stuff, and things are crazy busy, but at the end of the day, I lost my pen. That's my pencil. It'll work. Jana laughs at me for being over-prepared. I wanted my pen, not my pencil. But anyway, this will work. This was good. Thank you, Brady. I do want to take a few prayer requests. There's a couple I wanted to mention. Gerald called me right before the service. They spent most of the day in and out of doctor's visits. And I won't tell you the whole deal, but he's going to have surgery on the 13th to help with prostate and bladder and all of that kind of stuff. So pray for him. That's coming up pretty quick here. And then I also wanted to mention Lottie Moon. I've been trying to send out every day from that week of prayer. That's coming from me. I'm texting Patrick, and he's sending that out about things we can be praying for our International Mission Board. And today the request was, I can't send the whole thing. There's not Patrick's been very kind to me. He called me and he said, man, you got 160 characters. Try again. And I had to type it. So anyway, I can't send the whole thing, but this today was praying specifically for missionaries as they work with refugees. And about a year and a half or so ago, I got a postcard here at the church from Randy Greer. So the name that I mentioned today is someone I've emailed back and forth with him. I haven't met him in person. He and his wife were on furlough and stayed at First Baptist Maryville's mission house for a while. So they were actually in town when they were on furlough. But he was in Crimea and ended up leaving during COVID and then not being allowed to go back because that was one of the first places that Russia took over when they went marching. So the people that he was working with went through the occupation, and then I think they went through the liberation when Ukraine took it back, and I think it might be under Russian control again. I'm not sure. But I want to mention him in particular. I was reading his last update, and they are doing everything they can to get back to that city where the people are.